Welcome to this module on gender and humanitarian action. I'm Dr. Vandana Sharma, a global health researcher at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. My research focuses on gender and gender-based violence in both humanitarian and non-humanitarian settings, and in particular on designing and testing interventions to prevent and reduce forms of gender-based violence. I'm very pleased to be with you today to discuss some of the fundamental concepts related to gender and humanitarian action. So let's get started. The objectives of this introductory module on gender and humanitarian action are to introduce concepts related to gender-relevant humanitarian programming and to lay the foundation for more in-depth exploration of the topic, to identify valuable gender resources to enhance learning and practice, and also to interrogate our own behaviors and actions through self-reflection. Ultimately, I hope completion of this module will provide the basic building blocks, including key terminologies and understanding of important gender concepts, to enable both practical application as well as further advanced learning. We will cover three main thematic areas during this session. First, we will spend some time defining and understanding key gender terms and concepts. It is important that we start with a common understanding of the terminologies before proceeding to more advanced topics. Second, we will assess our own biases, and these are both implicit and explicit biases, and their potential impact, and we will reflect on actions to minimize these biases. Third, we will discuss gender mainstreaming and what this means when we are speaking about humanitarian action. This is undoubtedly an immense topic, and we won't have time or the ability to cover it comprehensively in this module. Rather, I'll briefly introduce the topic and provide some resources in the accompanying links for your continued independent learning. Let's begin by focusing on some of the key terms and concepts related to gender. First, what is gender? What are we speaking about when we use the term gender? Gender refers to the social attributes and opportunities that are associated with being male and female, and the relationships between women and men and girls and boys. These attributes, opportunities, and relationships are socially constructed, learned, and changeable over time. Sex, in contrast, refers to the physical differences between males and females that are determined by biology. That's an important distinction to make. The social construct of gender is built through cultural, political, and social practices and often defines the roles of women, girls, men, and boys. These are called gender roles, and they are taught, learned, and absorbed. For example, gender often defines the duties and responsibilities expected of women, girls, men, and boys. The consequences of not adopting gender roles and characteristics can range from discrimination, prejudice, stigma, increased exposure to violence, difficulty accessing humanitarian services, and being overlooked during needs assessments. Gender, therefore, along with age, sexual orientation, and gender identity, determines the power that women, girls, men, and boys have. By power, we are referring to the degree of control over material, human, intellectual, and financial resources exercised by different sections of society. So what is gender equality? Gender equality is where women and men of all ages, and regardless of sexual orientation or gender self-identification, enjoy the same status and have equal conditions, responsibilities, and opportunities for realizing their full human rights and potential. Gender equality encompasses equality in social relations and equal access to and control over resources by women and men. Equality here does not mean that women and men are the same, but rather that their enjoyment of rights, opportunities, and life chances are not governed or limited by whether they are male or female. Though international legal frameworks guarantee equal rights to women and men, their lived experiences are often different. In many settings, men hold gender roles that yield considerably higher social, economic, and political power than those of women and girls. This means that men have more decision-making power and autonomy in their lives than women do. We know that women often have less access than men to material resources, legal recognition, public knowledge and information, decision-making power, and economic power. And we also know that women often have less control over fertility, sexuality, and marital choices than men do. Sex disaggregated data, which are data that are collected and tabulated separately by sex, help us to identify these differences. It is also important to be able to differentiate between gender equality and gender equity. Gender equity is when women, girls, men, and boys have access to the rights, resources, and services, as well as opportunities that are defined by their specific needs. Gender equality goes beyond that. All are free to make their own choices without limitations set by gender roles. What this means is that the diversity in behavior, needs, and aspirations of women and men are equally valued and considered. It does not mean that men and women are the same, but it means that their enjoyment of rights and opportunities is equal. It's important to note that this is not just a women's issue. This issue concerns men and requires their engagement. The lives of men and boys, too, are strongly influenced by expectations of masculinity that shape their behavior and influence their actions and responsibilities. It's therefore imperative to include men in order to develop more equitable relationships. Gender inequality is a form of power inequality. It is influenced by other factors of identity, such as class, ethnicity, disability, age, and sexuality. The intersection of these factors can result in marginalization and inequality. Now let's discuss gender stereotypes. Stereotypes are a type of prejudice that makes widespread simplified conceptions of people. For example, the statement, "all men are violent," would be considered a stereotype. A stereotype that's gendered is a stereotype about the traits, characteristics of, and activities that are appropriate to men and women. I'd like you now to pause the video for a few minutes and think about the following question. What are some examples of gender stereotypes that you've come across in your workplace? Perhaps even make a list of these different gender stereotypes for men and women. Another activity that I'd like for you to participate in is an implicit bias test. I provided a link at the bottom of the slide. Explicit attitudes are those at the conscious level that are deliberately formed and easy to self-report. Implicit attitudes, on the other hand, are at the unconscious level. They're involuntarily formed and are typically unknown to us. The website that I've shared with you allows you to conduct an implicit association test to measure any implicit attitudes you may harbor but don't know about. It's quite an interesting activity that can help you in your process of self-reflection. I'll ask you to either pause the video now and conduct the test, or to do it later. But please save your results and reflect on them and what this might mean for your work and potential strategies that you might be able to implement to challenge any biases that you may harbor. Now, our own gender and personal beliefs about gender equality do affect the way we interact with male and female colleagues in the workplace, as well as the way we design and implement humanitarian programs. Exerting leadership in gender requires us to be aware of these dynamics and to challenge gender stereotypes and discrimination. Before moving on to the next section on gender considerations in humanitarian programming, this would be a good time to pause the video and to think more about your own personal attitudes and beliefs and about how these might be influencing your work. How might you challenge gender stereotypes and discrimination within your work environment? All right, now we will shift gears a little bit to discuss how to consider gender within the context of humanitarian programming. As I mentioned earlier, this is a vast subject area, and we only have time to just start to explore some of the fundamental concepts. When we are thinking about humanitarian crises, we must understand first that there are gender inequalities that already exist before a crisis begins. The crisis impacts women, girls, men, and boys differently due to their differing status and roles within society. This is important because these pre-existing inequalities can be exacerbated in times of crises and can limit access of these different groups to the resources and services that they need in order to be resilient and to recover. It's therefore essential to integrate gender equality into all humanitarian action in order to ensure inclusive, effective, efficient, and empowering responses. Let's consider in more detail how women, girls, men, and boys might be affected differently by humanitarian crises. First, crises can exacerbate pre-existing gender inequalities. For example, socially prescribed roles of women, such as those related to caretaking or restrictions on traveling alone, can make it difficult for them to seek safety. Young men may face forced recruitment into armed groups, and girls might be forced into early marriage in the hopes of protection. We also have evidence that women and girls are disproportionately affected during humanitarian emergencies. For example, the Indian Ocean tsunami resulted in the death of 4 women to every 1 man in India and Sri Lanka. Second, women, girls, men, and boys have specific needs during a crisis. As an example, the risks of sexual violence are different based on gender and gender roles. And third, women, girls, men, and boys have specific viewpoints and capacities, and understanding these can ensure that diverse groups are better targeted in the humanitarian response. Integrating gender into all aspects of humanitarian programming is therefore essential. This diagram shows the humanitarian program cycle. By integrating gender into these different phases, it facilitates the right to participation, affords protection, increases access to assistance, and promotes transformative change. Gender mainstreaming is a shorthand way of saying that the impact of all policies and programs on women and men should be considered at every stage of the program cycle, from planning to implementation and evaluation, and it facilitates the design of more appropriate and effective responses. The Interagency Standing Committee has published a guidance document called the Gender Handbook for Humanitarian Action. This handbook is a tool for humanitarian actors to plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate programs with a gender lens. It is designed for field practitioners and those leading humanitarian response, and provides detailed guidance in 11 different sectors such as education, food, security, health, livelihoods, and so on developing sector-specific solutions using gender analysis. Note that the detailed guidance on gender-based violence in humanitarian settings is provided in a separate IASC handbook. This brings us to the end of this brief introductory session on gender and humanitarian action. Feel free to explore the links to additional resources provided along with this video.